6 men jumped into occupied France on the eve of D-Day carrying 200 burlap corpses and a handful of gramophones loaded with the sounds of battle. Their mission: convince an entire German army that thousands of paratroopers were landing in the wrong place. 42 days after, not a single Allied command knew whether they were alive or dead. This is the story of Operation Titanic, the strangest deception of the Second World War, and the men who became ghosts to save an invasion. The briefing room smelled of linseed oil and damp wool. Lieutenant Frederick Fowls stood at the back of the Nissan hut, arms folded across his chest, watching as the intelligence officer pulled the canvas tarp from a stack of shapes piled against the corrugated wall. What emerged looked like a heap of murdered scarecrows. Each figure was a crude assemblage of Hessian sacking stuffed with sand and straw, stitched into the rough silhouette of a man, complete with a parachute harness of webbing and shroud lines. The officer lifted one by its shoulder straps. It flopped obscenely, headless and limbless, a parody of the human form. "Roberts," the officer said, his voice flat. 200 of them. You'll push them out at 500 feet over the drop zones. They'll scatter across the countryside. And with any luck, Jerry will think the invasion's coming in from the wrong direction. Fowles stepped forward and ran a thumb across the burlap. The fabric was coarse, rough enough to leave a burn if you gripped it wrong. Inside, the sand shifted with a dry whisper. He hefted the dummy. 60 pounds, maybe 70. Close enough to a man in full kit that a ground observer in the dark wouldn't know the difference until he was standing over the crumpled thing with a torch. "They'll be mixed with pintails," the officer continued, gesturing to a wooden crate on the table. Fowles opened it. Inside were small devices no larger than a tin of boot polish, each fitted with a tiny striker mechanism and a length of cord. Simulated rifle fire. Pull the cord, drop it, and it'll pop off rounds for about 5 minutes. Sounds like a section engaging at close range. We've also got these. He tapped a gramophone, a portable wind-up model in a leather case. Recorded battle noises. Small arms fire, tracked vehicles, voices shouting orders. You plant these in the hedgerows, wind them up, and let them run. The Germans will hear an entire battalion deploying. Someone at the front of the room, Jenkins, a corporal from Herefordshire with a scar across his knuckles, let out a low whistle. "And what do we do after we've serenaded the bastards?" "You survive," the officer said. "Evade. Make your way back to Allied lines once the invasion's underway. If you can, gather intelligence. Sabotage targets of opportunity. But your primary job is to stay out of sight and stay alive." Fowles glanced at the other 5 men in the room. Davies, a Welsh lance corporal with a runner's build and a tendency to hum under his breath. Hewitt, silent and broad-shouldered, who'd been a miner before the war and still carried the dust of the Ronda in his lungs. 3 others whose names would blur together in the chaos of the weeks to come. All of them SAS, all of them volunteers for what the briefing had euphemistically called special employment behind enemy lines. The plan was mad, of course. That much was obvious. But madness had a way of working when the stakes were high enough, and the stakes, Fowles knew, could not be higher. Across the Channel, the largest amphibious invasion in history was being assembled in secret. Over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men set to storm 5 beaches on a 50-mile stretch of French coast. If the German reserves moved fast enough, if Rommel's panzers reached the beaches before the Allies could consolidate, the entire operation could collapse into a slaughter that would make Dieppe look like a skirmish. So they would drop 200 burlap men into the Norman countryside and hope that confusion, even for a few hours, would be enough. 3 nights later, Fowles stood in the belly of an Armstrong Whitworth Albemarle, gripping the static line as the aircraft bucked and shuddered through the dark. The fuselage was unheated, and the cold pressed through his battle dress like a fist. Around him, the other 5 men sat hunched on the metal bench, their faces shadowed under their helmets. The Roberts were piled at the rear of the bay, a mound of sacking and sand that shifted with each lurch of the plane. The gramophones, wrapped in oilcloth and secured with paracord, were strapped to their webbing alongside the pintails, grenades, Sten guns, and all the small lethal objects that constituted the inventory of a fighting patrol. The dispatcher, a pale-faced RAF sergeant, shouted over the roar of the engines. 5 minutes. Fowls checked his kit one last time. The Sten hung across his chest, the magazine seated and the safety on. His pistol, a Browning high-power, rode in a canvas holster at his hip. In the breast pocket of his smock, wrapped in waxed paper, was a map of the operational area. A grid of Norman hedgerows and sunken lanes northeast of St. Miraglise, where the American 82nd and 101st Airborne were meant to land in force. His job was to make the Germans think those divisions were landing 10 miles to the east. Stand up! They rose as one, hooking their static lines to the overhead cable. The dispatcher hauled open the door, and the noise became deafening. Wind screamed into the fuselage, cold and salt-laced, carrying the faint smell of diesel and burnt oil. Below, through the yawning black rectangle, Fowls could see nothing but darkness. No fires, no lights. France was a void. The red light above the door flicked to green. Go! Fowls pushed the first Robert through the door. Tumbled into the slipstream, the parachute snapping open with a crack. Then the second, the third. They fell like hanged men, a procession of the dead cast into the night. He worked mechanically, shoving each dummy clear, until the pile was gone and the dispatcher slapped his shoulder. Fowls didn't think. He stepped into the void. The parachute opened with a brutal jerk, the risers biting into his shoulders. For a moment there was only the sound of silk rippling overhead and the distant drone of the Albemarle climbing away. Then the ground rose up, faster than he expected, and he hit hard, rolling through wet grass and thistles. He came up on one knee, breathing hard, and thumbed the quick release on his harness. The parachute collapsed behind him in a white heap. Around him, shapes were falling. Some were men. He could see them by the way they moved, tucking and rolling as they hit. Others were Roberts, and they landed like sacks of grain, crumpling motionless in the hedgerows. Fowls pulled the Sten from his chest and swept the darkness. No shots, no voices. Only the rustle of wind through the trees and the low, distant growl of the aircraft climbing back toward England. Davies materialized from the shadows, breathing hard. We're down. How many? 4. Hewitt's got a twisted ankle. Jenkins is sorting the gramophones. 2 missing, then dead, captured, or simply scattered too far to regroup in the dark. Fowls made the calculation coldly. They'd trained for this. 6 men were always going to become 4 or 3 or fewer. The operation didn't depend on all of them surviving the drop. Get the pintails out, Fowles said. We've got 20 minutes before Jerry starts looking. They worked quickly, spreading out across the drop zone. Fowles moved through the hedgerows, placing the pintail simulators at intervals of 50 yards. Each device was simple. A spring-loaded striker that ignited a small pyrotechnic charge, producing a sharp crack that mimicked the report of a rifle. He pulled the cord on the first one and tossed it into the underbrush. 5 seconds later, it went off. Pop, 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 pop. A rapid stutter that sounded, in the stillness, exactly like a section of infantry engaging at close range. He moved to the next position, then the next until the night was alive with the sound of phantom gunfire. Jenkins had the gramophones set up in a shallow ditch. He wound the first one, set the needle and let it run. The tinny sound of recorded voices spilled out into the darkness. Shouted orders in English, the clatter of equipment, the metallic grind of tracked vehicles. It was crude, tinny, but in the confusion of a night operation, it might be enough. The effect was immediate. To the north, a flare arced into the sky, brilliant and white, casting the hedgerows into sharp relief. Then another and another. Fowles pressed himself into the base of a hedge and watched. In the distance, he could hear engines, trucks, or half-tracks moving fast along the road. A searchlight swept the fields, the beam cutting through the mist. The Germans were coming. The first patrol arrived within 15 minutes. Fowles watched from cover as a section of infantry moved cautiously through the drop zone, their rifles at the ready. They found a Robert almost immediately, a crumpled figure half buried in a ditch, and gathered around it, shouting to one another. One of them kicked the dummy, then bent down and pulled away the Hessian. Even from 100 yards away, Fowls could hear the confusion in their voices. But it was enough. The flares kept rising. More vehicles arrived, and then the heavier rumble of armor, panzers or self-propelled guns, repositioning to meet the threat. Fowls counted at least 2 companies moving into the area, and that was just what he could see. Somewhere to the west, the real airborne divisions were landing. Somewhere to the north, the first waves of infantry were climbing into their landing craft. And here, in this corner of Normandy, 2,000 German soldiers were chasing ghosts. By dawn, the SAS stick had withdrawn to a hide site 3 miles east. They moved in silence, keeping to the ditches and treelines, pausing every few hundred yards to listen. The countryside was alive with German activity. Convoys moving along the roads, patrols sweeping the hedgerows, the distant thump of artillery firing toward the coast. Fowls could hear the war now, a low sustained rumble that never stopped, like thunder trapped on the horizon. They buried the gramophones and the remaining pintails in a shallow cache, marking the location with a strip of parachute silk tied to a fence post. Then they dug in, scraping shallow trenches in the underbrush and covering themselves with branches and ferns. The exhaustion hit Fowls all at once, a leaden weight pressing down on his chest. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, and the adrenaline was draining away, leaving only the ache in his muscles and the dull throb of bruises from the landing. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the war wash over him. When he woke, it was midday, and Davies was shaking his shoulder. Movement on the road. Armored column heading north. Fowls crawled to the edge of the hide and peered through the undergrowth. A mile away, along the main highway, a line of panzers was moving at speed, their tracks throwing up clouds of dust. Behind them came half-tracks filled with infantry, and then trucks towing anti-tank guns. He counted 15 vehicles before the column disappeared around a bend. "They're moving reserves toward the beaches," he said quietly. But not all of them. That was the point. The Germans were hedging, keeping forces back in case the diversionary drops were the prelude to a larger airborne assault. It was working. The original plan had been simple. Drop the Roberts, create the illusion, then evade back to Allied lines within 48 hours. But the reality of the battlefield made that impossible. The entire region was swarming with German patrols, and the front line was still miles away, shifting and chaotic as the Allied beachheads expanded. Fowls made the decision on the second night. They would stay. Over the days that followed, they became ghosts. They moved only at night, navigating by compass and map, avoiding roads and farmhouses. During the day, they lay up in the hedgerows or in abandoned barns, sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations from their packs. The biscuits were hard enough to crack teeth, and the tins of meat had a greasy, metallic taste that clung to the back of the throat. They rationed water carefully, filling their canteens from streams and wells, always careful to purify it with the chlorine tablets that left everything tasting faintly of swimming pools. On the 4th day, they discovered an abandoned farmhouse at the edge of a wood. The building had taken a direct hit from something, artillery perhaps, or a bomb from the preliminary air campaign. Half the roof was gone, the beams charred and collapsed inward, and the windows were empty frames filled with shattered glass. But the cellar was intact, a stone vault that smelled of earth and potatoes. Fowls made the decision to shelter there for a full day, to rest properly and take stock of their situation. They descended the narrow stone steps in single file, their boots scraping on the worn treads. The cellar was dark and cool, the air thick with the smell of mildew. Hewitt lit a small candle stub, shielding the flame with his hand, and they could see the space properly. Rough stone walls, a dirt floor, wooden shelves that had once held preserves but now stood empty except for a few broken jars. In one corner, a heap of rotting sacks. In another, a wooden crate that turned out to contain nothing but rusted farm tools. They spread out along the walls, setting their kit down with care. Fowls pulled out the map and laid it flat on the ground, studying it by candlelight. Jenkins sat beside him, cleaning the sten with a rag and a small bottle of gun oil. Davies lay with his back against the wall, his eyes closed, breathing shallowly. Hewitt stood at the base of the stairs, listening. "How far to the American lines?" Jenkins asked, his voice low. Fowls measured the distance with his thumb. 12 miles. Maybe 15. Hard to say with the front moving. And how many Germans between us and them? Enough. Jenkins grunted and went back to cleaning the sten. The bolt slid back and forth with a quiet metallic whisper. Fowls watched him work, methodical and precise, breaking the weapon down to its component parts and inspecting each one before reassembling it. It was a ritual, something to occupy the hands and the mind while the body rested. Outside, through the shattered ceiling above, they could hear the war. Artillery fire, distant but constant. The rumble of aircraft, bombers probably, heading inland to strike at German supply lines. Once, the sharp crack of small arms fire, close enough that they all froze, hands on weapons, waiting. But the firing moved away, and after a few minutes they relaxed. Fowls allowed himself to think, for the first time in days, about what they were doing. The operation had succeeded in its immediate objective. The Germans had been deceived. The Roberts had done their job. But now, trapped behind enemy lines with no working radio and dwindling supplies, the mission had transformed into something else. Survival. And survival, in a war zone saturated with enemy forces, was less a matter of skill than of luck. He thought about the beaches. Were the Americans ashore? Were they pushing inland? Or were they pinned down in the surf, dying by the hundreds under German machine gun fire? He thought about the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st. Had they secured their objectives? Or were they scattered and surrounded, fighting desperate holding actions in the hedgerows? There was no way to know. The cellar was a sealed box, and the only reality was the dirt floor beneath him and the men breathing quietly in the dark. Davies coughed, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to echo in the confined space. Fowls glanced at him. The lance corporal's face was pale, even in the candlelight, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the coolness of the cellar. "You all right?" Fowls asked. Davies nodded, but his eyes said otherwise. "Just tired, sir. I'll be fine." Fowls didn't press. There was nothing to be done about it anyway. They had no medicine, no way to treat anything beyond the most basic injuries. If Davies was getting sick, bronchitis, pneumonia, an infection from some unseen cut, then he would either recover on his own or he wouldn't. That was the arithmetic of war. They slept in shifts, 2 men awake at all times, one at the top of the stairs listening, the other in the cellar watching the rest. Fowls took the first watch, sitting with his back to the stone wall and the sten across his knees. The candle had burned down to a stub, casting long shadows that moved with the flicker of the flame. He could hear Jenkins breathing, slow and steady, already asleep. Hewitt was at the stairs, a dark silhouette against the faint gray light filtering down from above. Time moved strangely in the dark. Fowls's watch said it was 3 in the afternoon, but it could have been midnight for all the difference it made. He thought about home, a village in Kent, a small house with a garden, his mother tending roses. He thought about the men he'd trained with, some of them dead now, killed in North Africa or Sicily or in training accidents that were kept out of the newspapers. He thought about the war and how long it had been going on, and how much longer it might go before it was finished. The candle went out. He didn't relight it. On the 5th night, they began to take targets of opportunity. The decision was pragmatic. They couldn't reach Allied lines quickly, and sitting idle meant wasting the opportunity to gather intelligence or disrupt German operations. Fowls divided the stick into 2 teams. He and Jenkins would handle reconnaissance and small-scale sabotage. Hewitt and Davies would remain at the hide site, monitoring the surrounding area and maintaining security. The first target was a German telephone line that ran along the main road to Corentin. Fowls and Jenkins moved through the dark, their faces smeared with dirt, their kit stripped down to the essentials. Sten guns, grenades, wire cutters, a coil of rope. They reached the road just after midnight and found the telephone line strung between wooden poles, the wire sagging slightly in the night breeze. Jenkins climbed the first pole, his movements smooth and practiced. He'd been a lineman before the war, working for the post office in Hereford, and he moved up the pole with the confidence of a man who'd done the job 1,000 times. At the top, he pulled the wire cutters from his belt and snipped the line cleanly. The severed ends fell away, curling in the air, and Jenkins spliced a short length of dummy wire in place, crimping the connections so they looked intact from the ground. The break would be invisible to a casual inspection, but it would disrupt communications for hours, maybe days, until German engineers could locate the fault. They hit 3 more telephone lines that night, spacing the breaks over a 10-mile stretch of road. By the time they returned to the hide site, it was nearly dawn, and Fowls's legs were shaking with exhaustion. The second night, they targeted a small supply depot, a cluster of tents and wooden sheds guarded by a single sentry. Fowls watched the depot from a distance, timing the sentry's patrol. The man walked a predictable route, circling the perimeter every 15 minutes, pausing at each corner to light a cigarette. Fowls waited until the sentry was at the far end of his route, then moved. He crossed the open ground in a low crouch, the Sten held ready. The first shed was unlocked. Inside, he found crates of ammunition, cases of K rations, jerry cans of fuel. He set a small charge, a block of plastic explosive with a pencil detonator, and moved to the next shed. This one held uniforms, boots, medical supplies. He took what he could carry: bandages, morphine syringes, a bottle of sulfa powder, and set another charge. The sentry never saw him. Fowls was back in the treeline, 200 yards away, when the charges went off. The explosions were sharp and bright, lighting up the night, and the secondary detonations. Ammunition cooking off, fuel igniting, turned the depot into an inferno. By the time the Germans organized a response, Fowls was half a mile away, moving through a drainage ditch toward the rendezvous point. They kept at it, night after night, taking risks that would have been insane in any other context, but that seemed almost reasonable given the chaos of the battlefield. They cut more telephone lines. They sabotaged a railway junction, placing small charges on the tracks and waiting in the dark until a supply train came through. The locomotive derailed, the cars jackknifing behind it, and the resulting pileup blocked the line for 2 days. They ambushed a motorcycle courier on a rural road, killing the rider with a single shot and taking the dispatch case he carried. Inside were maps, orders, intelligence summaries, all of it valuable, all of it confirming what Fowls had already suspected. The Germans were struggling to coordinate their response to the invasion. Their communications were degraded. Their supply lines were under constant attack from the air. Their reserves were committed piecemeal, rushed to the front without proper reconnaissance or planning. Fowls folded the documents into his smock and moved on. On the 18th night, they hit a German supply convoy. It was a small target, 2 trucks moving without escort along a secondary road, and they had the advantage of position. Fowls placed Hewitt and Jenkins in the ditch on one side of the road, himself and Davies on the other. When the lead truck came into view, its headlights masked to thin slits, Fowls let it close to within 20 yards before he opened fire. The Sten bucked against his shoulder, the rounds punching through the cab in a tight grouping. The truck swerved, crashed into the hedgerow, and stalled. The second truck braked hard, and the driver tried to reverse, but Jenkins was already moving, a Mills grenade in his hand. He pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds, and threw. The grenade bounced once and rolled under the rear axle. The explosion lifted the truck off its wheels, and when it came down, the frame was twisted, the cargo bed engulfed in flames. They moved in fast. The driver of the lead truck was dead, slumped over the wheel. The passenger was alive but badly wounded, bleeding from a chest wound that bubbled and hissed with each breath. Fowls put a round in his head, quick, clinical, and moved to the back of the truck. Inside were crates of ammunition, cases of K rations, and a canvas satchel containing German maps and signal logs. He grabbed the satchel and as many rations as he could carry, then set a charge on the remaining ammunition. The explosion would erase any evidence of what they'd taken. They were half a mile away when the charge went off, a deep, resonant boom that echoed across the countryside. Fowls didn't look back. The maps changed everything. Spread out on the floor of an abandoned stone cottage, they revealed the disposition of German forces in the sector: strongpoints, supply routes, reserve positions. The signal logs contained encrypted messages, but even without breaking the code, the traffic analysis was valuable. Certain units were requesting reinforcements. Others were reporting losses. The pattern was clear. The Germans were stretched thin, their reserves committed piecemeal, their command structure fraying under the pressure of the Allied advance. Fowls knew this information needed to reach Allied intelligence. But without a working radio, they were cut off. The only option was to try to reach the front line on foot. They tried the radio twice more. The first attempt was on the 20th night, from a position on high ground overlooking a valley. Jenkins assembled the set with care, unspooling the antenna wire and draping it over the branches of a tree. Fowls cranked the generator, the handle squeaking rhythmically, while Hewitt kept watch. Jenkins adjusted the frequency, listened, transmitted a brief message in code. Static. He tried again. More static. Then, faintly, a voice, English distorted, barely audible. Jenkins leaned in, straining to hear. The voice cut out. He tried again, but there was nothing. They abandoned the attempt after 10 minutes. The longer they stayed in one place with the radio active, the greater the risk of German direction-finding equipment locating them. They packed the set away and moved, and 3 hours later, from a mile away, they saw flares rising over the spot where they'd been. The Germans had found it. The second attempt was even briefer. Jenkins got the set working, transmitted a single burst, call sign, position, request for extraction, and then they heard engines. Motorzyklus, closing fast. They buried the radio in a shallow hole, covered it with dirt and leaves, and ran. The motorcycles passed within 100 yards of the cache, searchlights sweeping the hedgerows. Fowls lay flat in a ditch, his face pressed into the mud, and counted the seconds until the engines faded into the distance. After that, they stopped trying. The radio was a liability. If they couldn't use it without drawing immediate German attention, then it was worthless. They would have to reach the American lines on their own. By the 25th day, they were within 10 miles of the front. The signs were everywhere. Abandoned German positions, hastily dug foxholes filled with empty shell casings and discarded equipment. The roads were cratered from airstrikes, and the fields were littered with the wreckage of vehicles. Burned-out half-tracks, overturned trucks, a Panzer IV with its turret blown clean off, the metal twisted and blackened. They moved cautiously, staying off the roads, following the sunken lanes and drainage ditches. The air smelled of smoke and cordite, and the sound of artillery was constant now, a deep rolling thunder that shook the ground. At night, the horizon flashed with muzzle flares, and they could see the tracer rounds arcing across the sky, red and white, crisscrossing in patterns that were almost beautiful. But the Germans were still here, dug in along a defensive line that ran roughly parallel to the front. Fowls studied the line through binoculars from a position in the upper floor of a ruined church. The building had been hit by something, a shell probably, and the roof was gone, the walls pocked with shrapnel. But the stone staircase was intact, and from the top, he had a clear view of the German positions. They were strong. He could see machine gun nests, slit trenches, bunkers reinforced with logs and sandbags. Barbed wire stretched across the fields in long, tangled coils, and he could see the telltale signs of minefields. White tape markers, disturbed earth. Behind the line, in a cluster of farmhouses, he could see a command post. Radio antennas, vehicles, soldiers moving with purpose. Going through the line would be suicide. Going around would take days, and they didn't have days. Davies was worse. The cough had turned into a fever, and he was barely able to walk. Hewitt was carrying most of his kit, but even that wouldn't be enough if Davies collapsed. They needed to cross the line, and they needed to do it soon. Fowls made the decision on the 27th night. They would move under cover of darkness, infiltrate the line at a weak point, and try to reach the American positions beyond. It was a gamble, but everything now was a gamble. They moved out at midnight, Davies in the center of the group, supported by Hewitt. Fowls led, Jenkins brought up the rear. They moved slowly, pausing every few steps to listen. The night was overcast, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and the darkness was almost absolute. They navigated by compass and by memory, following a drainage ditch that ran roughly perpendicular to the German line. The ditch was deep, perhaps 6 feet, and the bottom was choked with nettles and brambles. Fowls moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. Behind him, he could hear Davy's breathing, a wet, labored sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. They were within 300 yards of the German line when Davies coughed. It was a wet, choking sound, and it seemed to echo across the field. Fowls froze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the German positions, a voice shouted an order. A flare went up, bathing the field in harsh white light. Fowls pressed himself into the bottom of the ditch. The flare hung in the sky, swaying gently on its parachute, casting shadows that jumped and twisted. He could see the German positions now, stark and clear. The machine gun nests, the slit trenches, the dark shapes of soldiers moving behind the wire. He could hear voices, German voices, urgent and sharp. Footsteps on gravel. The metallic click of a rifle bolt. Another flare went up, and then another. The field was lit like a stage, and Fowls knew they'd been seen. He heard a shout, closer now, and then the crack of a rifle shot. The round snapped over his head, and he pressed himself lower into the ditch. Then the mortars opened up. The first round landed 50 yards to the left, the explosion tearing a crater in the earth and sending clods of dirt raining down. The second was closer. The third hit the edge of the ditch, perhaps 20 yards behind Fowls, and the blast wave slammed into him like a physical thing, driving the air from his lungs and filling his mouth with the taste of dirt and blood. His ears rang, a high, piercing tone that obliterated all other sound. He rolled onto his side, gasping, and saw Davies lying a few feet away, motionless. Blood was pooling beneath him, black in the flare light. Fowls crawled toward him, his movements sluggish, his vision swimming. He reached for Davies's shoulder and felt the hot wetness of a wound. The lance corporal's eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his chest was still. More flares went up. The mortars were firing in a pattern now, walking the rounds back and forth across the field. Fowls couldn't hear them, but he could feel the concussions, each one a brutal punch to the chest. Somewhere behind him, Jenkins was shouting, but the words were lost in the ringing. Then the machine guns started. Tracers streaked across the field, red and white, crisscrossing the darkness in patterns of mechanical precision. Fowls saw Jenkins stand, saw him take 2 steps toward the hedgerow, and then he was down, cut almost in half by a sustained burst. Hewitt was crawling toward a shell crater, but he didn't make it. A mortar round landed directly where he'd been, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but scorched earth. Fowls lay still. The firing continued for another 5 minutes. Mortars, machine guns, rifles, all of it concentrated on the ditch and the field beyond. Then, gradually, it stopped. The flares stopped. The night went quiet again, except for the ringing in his ears and the distant murmur of voices. He felt hands on him, rough and urgent, pulling him out of the ditch. A flashlight shone in his face, blinding. German voices, rapid and harsh. Someone kicked the Sten away from his hand. Someone else searched him, pulling the maps and signal logs from his smock, the pistol from his holster, the morphine syringes from his pocket. They hauled him to his feet, and he stood swaying, his legs barely holding him, blood running down the side of his face from a cut he didn't remember receiving. They marched him back through the German lines, past the machine gun nests and bunkers, past the farmhouses where officers were standing in doorways watching. No one spoke to him. They took him to a command post, a cellar beneath a stone barn, and pushed him down the narrow stairs into a room lit by a kerosene lantern. An officer sat behind a makeshift desk, a door balanced on 2 wooden crates. He was a captain, perhaps 40, with a thin face and iron-gray hair. His uniform was clean, pressed, incongruous in the midst of the mud and chaos outside. He looked at Fowls for a long moment, his expression neutral, then gestured to a chair. "Seat." Fowls sat. His hands were shaking, and he couldn't stop them. The officer pushed a glass of water across the desk. Fowls drank it in 3 swallows, the liquid cool and clean, washing away the taste of dirt and blood. The officer spread the maps and documents on the desk, studying them carefully. He glanced at the signal logs, then at Fowls. "You are SAS. he said in accented but clear English. Special Air Service. Parachute troops. Fowls said nothing. Name, rank, serial number. That was all he was required to give. The officer nodded, as if he'd expected the silence. You have been operating behind our lines for some time. The telephone lines, the supply depot, the railway junction. We thought it was partisans, French resistance. But no. He tapped the documents. It was you. A handful of men. Fowls kept his face neutral. Don't confirm, don't deny. Let them make their assumptions. The officer leaned back in his chair. You will be taken to the rear, processed as a prisoner of war. The documents you carried will be forwarded to intelligence. You have my word that you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Fowls nodded once. It was all he could manage. They took him to a holding pen, a barn with barbed wire strung across the windows and a guard posted at the door. Inside were a dozen other prisoners, British and American, most of them wounded. A German medic came through, efficient and brisk, cleaning wounds and distributing bandages. When the medic reached Fowls, he examined the cut on his forehead, applied a stinging antiseptic, and wrapped it with a strip of gauze. Then he moved on. Fowls sat with his back against the wall and closed his eyes. Davies was dead. Jenkins was dead. Hewitt was dead. The other two, the men whose names had blurred in his memory, had vanished on the first night, either dead in the drop or captured in the initial chaos. Of the 6 who had jumped, only he remained. The arithmetic was brutal and final. He slept, if it could be called sleep. It was more a kind of collapse, his body shutting down from exhaustion and blood loss. When he woke, it was daylight, and the barn was filled with the sound of men breathing, coughing, groaning. Someone nearby was praying in a low whisper. Someone else was crying, trying to muffle the sound with his hands. They came for him on the second day. 2 guards, young and nervous, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They marched him out of the barn and into a truck, where he sat on a wooden bench alongside for other prisoners. The truck drove east, away from the sound of artillery, into quieter country where the war seemed distant and abstract. The POW camp was a converted factory compound on the outskirts of a small town whose name Fowls never learned. High wire fences, guard towers, rows of wooden barracks. They processed him methodically. Photographed, fingerprinted, interrogated by an intelligence officer who asked the same questions in different ways for 3 hours straight. Fowls gave his name, rank, and serial number, and nothing else. The officer seemed almost bored, as if he'd done this 1,000 times and knew exactly how it would end. You were part of the parachute operation on the 6th of June, the officer said. It wasn't a question. Fowls stared at the wall behind him. The dummies, the Roberts, the sound equipment. Very clever. The officer tapped his pen against the desk. You tied up an entire division for most of the night. Cost us perhaps 6 hours of reaction time. In the end, it made no difference. Your invasion succeeded. You are here. The war continues. Fowls said nothing. The officer sighed, closed his notebook, and waved him away. They assigned him to Barracks 7, a long wooden structure with bunks stacked 3 high and a single stove at one end. The men inside were a mix of nationalities, British, American, Canadian, a few Poles. They eyed him as he entered, assessing, calculating. New prisoners were always a source of news, and news in a POW camp was currency. Where were you captured? Someone asked, an American corporal with a North Carolina accent. Near the front, Fowls said. Which sector? Can't say. The corporal nodded, accepting this. You with the airborne? SAS. That got their attention. The SAS had a reputation, and men who'd been behind the lines carried a certain mystique. They asked him questions, carefully, obliquely, and he answered when he could, deflecting when he couldn't. He told them about the drop in general terms. He told them about the deception. He did not tell them about Davies dying in the ditch, or Jenkins cut down in the field, or the long nights of sabotage and evasion. Those were his, and he would carry them alone. The days in the camp stretched into weeks and the weeks into months. The routine was deadening. Morning roll call, a thin soup for breakfast, work details in the afternoon, another thin soup for dinner. The Red Cross parcels arrived sporadically, bringing chocolate, cigarettes, tinned meat, luxuries that were divided and traded with the fervor of merchants in a bazaar. Men built elaborate systems of barter, exchanging cigarettes for food, food for favors, favors for information. Fowls kept to himself. He read when he could find books. He exercised, doing press-ups and sit-ups in the narrow space between the bunks. He listened to the BBC broadcasts that the guards played over the camp loudspeakers, propaganda mostly, but occasionally there were fragments of real news. The Allies were advancing. Paris had been liberated. The Red Army was driving west. He thought about the operation. Had it mattered? The intelligence officer had said it made no difference, but Fowls knew that was a lie. 6 hours of confusion, 6 hours of German reserves chasing ghosts, 6 hours in which the men on the beaches had consolidated their positions and pushed inland. In war, 6 hours could be the difference between success and catastrophe. The Allies had needed every advantage, every deception, every trick. And the Roberts had worked. He thought about the men who'd died. Davies, who'd hummed to himself when he was nervous. Jenkins, who'd climbed telephone poles with the ease of a man who'd done it all his life. Hewitt, who never said much but who could be counted on when it mattered. They had known the risks. They had volunteered. But knowing the risks and dying in a ditch in occupied France were two different things, and Fowls carried the weight of their deaths like a stone in his chest. In October, the Red Cross arranged for prisoners to send letters home. Fowls wrote to his mother, a brief note saying he was alive and well, that he'd been captured but was being treated correctly, that she shouldn't worry. He didn't mention the operation. He didn't mention the men who'd died. He kept it simple, factual, the kind of letter that would pass the censors without difficulty. The reply came 2 months later, a thin envelope with his mother's handwriting on the front. She wrote about the garden, about the neighbors, about the dog they'd had when he was a child that had died while he was in North Africa. She wrote that she was proud of him, that she prayed for him every night, that she knew he would come home. The letter was careful, circumspect, the kind of letter written by someone who knew the censors were reading every word. But between the lines, Fowls could hear her voice, and for a moment, sitting on his bunk in a POW camp in Germany, he felt the distance between them as an almost physical pain. Winter came. The camp was cold, brutally so, and the thin blankets they were issued did nothing to keep out the chill. Men huddled around the stove, feeding it with scraps of wood and coal dust, arguing over who got to sleep closest to the heat. Frostbite was common. So was dysentery, spread by the poor sanitation and the contaminated water. The camp infirmary was overwhelmed, and men died, not from wounds or violence, but from disease and cold and despair. Fowls survived by routine. He woke at the same time every day. He exercised at the same time. He ate his rations slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, making them last. He read whatever he could find. Ancient newspapers, battered novels, a German-English dictionary that someone had smuggled in. He learned German, haltingly at first, then with greater fluency. It gave him something to focus on, a way to occupy his mind. In March, the rumors started. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Germans were retreating on all fronts. The war was ending. The guards grew nervous, their discipline slipping. Some of them disappeared, replaced by older men, reservists who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The rations, already meager, shrank further. The Red Cross parcels stopped coming. And then, one morning in April, the guards were gone. The prisoners woke to find the gates standing open, the towers unmanned. For a moment, no one moved. It seemed like a trick, a trap. Then someone walked to the gate, peered out, and turned back to the others. "They're gone," he said. "The bastards are gone." The camp emptied in a matter of hours. Men walked out into the spring sunshine, blinking, disoriented, unsure of what to do next. Some headed west, toward the sound of artillery, toward the Allied lines. Others simply wandered, drunk on the sudden freedom, not caring where they went as long as it was away from the camp. Fowls walked west. He moved carefully, staying off the main roads, avoiding the columns of refugees and retreating soldiers that clogged the highways. The countryside was in chaos. Burned-out vehicles littered the roadsides. Farmhouses stood empty, their doors hanging open, their contents looted. He passed through villages where white sheets hung from the windows, signs of surrender, and others where German soldiers still held defensive positions, their eyes hollow, their uniforms filthy. On the third day, he encountered a British patrol, a section of infantry moving cautiously through a forest. They trained their rifles on him until he identified himself, and even then they were skeptical. He looked like a scarecrow, thin and ragged, his uniform hanging loose, his face gaunt. But he had his dog tags and he had his story, and eventually they believed him. They took him back to a field hospital, where a doctor examined him, declared him malnourished but otherwise healthy, and sent him on to a processing center. There, he was debriefed by an intelligence officer who took notes in a small leather-bound book and asked questions about the camp, the guards, the other prisoners. The officer was polite, efficient, and utterly uninterested in anything that had happened before Fowls's capture. "What about the operation?" Fowls asked. "Titanic. The Roberts. Did it work?" The officer glanced up from his notes. "I'm not familiar with that operation. The paradrop on the night of the 5th. The Dummies. The deception." The officer frowned, flipped through a file, found nothing. "I'll make a note of it. Someone will follow up." No one did. Fowls was repatriated to England in May, on a transport ship crowded with liberated POWs and wounded soldiers. The crossing was rough, the sea gray and cold, and Fowls spent most of it on deck, staring at the water and thinking about nothing in particular. When they docked in Southampton, there were bands playing and people cheering, and it all seemed surreal, disconnected from the reality of the past year. He went home to Kent, to the small house with the garden, and his mother cried when she saw him. She fed him, fussed over him, asked him questions he couldn't answer. He stayed for a week, sleeping in his old room, walking through the village, trying to reconnect with a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Then he went back to London, to the SAS headquarters, to file his report. The report was brief. He described the operation, the drop, the deployment of the Roberts and the sound equipment, the German reaction. He described the decision to remain active, the sabotage operations, the evasion, the capture. He listed the names of the men who died and the circumstances of their deaths. He included the maps and signal logs he'd carried, though he assumed the Germans had already forwarded them to their own intelligence services. The report was filed, acknowledged, and forgotten. In September, Fowls received a letter informing him that he'd been awarded the Military Cross for exceptional courage and resourcefulness in the face of the enemy. The citation was vague, mentioning his actions during a classified operation in support of Allied landings in Normandy. There was no mention of the Roberts, or the pintails, or the gramophones. There was no mention of Davies, Jenkins, or Hewitt. He accepted the medal at a small ceremony in London, shook hands with a general whose name he didn't catch, and went back to his flat. He put the medal in a drawer and didn't look at it again for 20 years. The war ended. Men came home or didn't. The country rebuilt. Fowls left the army, found work as a surveyor, married a schoolteacher from Sussex, had 2 children. He didn't talk about the war. When people asked, he said he'd been in the SAS, that he'd been captured, that he'd been a POW. He didn't mention the operation. It seemed somehow too strange to explain, too unlikely to be believed. But sometimes, late at night, he would think about that field in Normandy. He would think about the Roberts tumbling through the darkness, the pintails crackling in the hedgerows, the gramophones playing their tinny recordings of battle. He would think about the German soldiers, stumbling through the bocage in the darkness, chasing shadows and echoes. And he would think about the men on the beaches, fighting their way ashore while 2,000 German soldiers were 10 miles away, hunting ghosts. It wasn't until the 1970s that historians began to piece together the full story of D-Day's deception operations. Documents were declassified. Veterans were interviewed. Slowly, the truth emerged. Operation Titanic had been one piece of a massive, coordinated deception campaign that included false radio traffic, dummy landing craft, double agents, and elaborate feints designed to convince the Germans that the invasion would come anywhere but Normandy. The Roberts had worked. The Dummies, scattered across the countryside, had convinced German commanders that a large-scale airborne assault was underway in the wrong location. Units had been diverted. Reserves had been held back. And in those crucial hours between midnight and dawn, while the Germans chased phantoms, the real invasion had consolidated. A single Roberts survived the war. It was found by a French farmer in 1947, tangled in the branches of a tree, the Hessian faded and torn but still recognizable. The farmer donated it to a museum, where it sat in storage for 30 years before someone realized what it was. Today, it's on display in Portsmouth, in a glass case in the D-Day Museum. Visitors walk past it without pausing. It looks like nothing, a bag of sand, a crude trick. Fowls saw it once in 1985 on a trip to Portsmouth with his wife. He stood in front of the case for a long time, studying the dummy, remembering the weight of it in his hands, the rough texture of the Hessian, the sound it made when it hit the ground. His wife asked him if he was all right, and he nodded, said he was fine, and they moved on to the next exhibit. 2 years later, the BBC contacted him. They were making a documentary about D-Day deceptions and had come across his name in the declassified files. Would he be willing to be interviewed? He agreed. The interview took place in his garden, on a warm afternoon in June. The interviewer was young, earnest, clearly thrilled to be speaking to someone who'd actually been there. She asked him about the operation, about the drop, about what it felt like to jump into occupied France carrying burlap dummies and gramophones. "We knew the odds," Fowles said, his voice quiet. "We knew most of us wouldn't come back. But if dropping a few hundred sacks of sand could buy even an hour for the men on the beaches, then it was worth it." The interviewer asked him if he thought the operation had made a difference. Fowles looked out across the garden, at the roses his wife had planted, at the apple tree where their grandchildren played. "I think it bought them the morning," he said. "And sometimes that's enough." He died 3 months later in his sleep at the age of 68. The obituaries mentioned his military cross, his service in the SAS, his time as a POW. One of them, in the Times, included a brief paragraph about Operation Titanic, noting that he had been one of the last surviving participants in one of the war's strangest and most effective deceptions. The Roberts in the museum remains. The Hessian has faded to a pale brown, the stitching visible where the seams have started to pull apart. A small placard beside the case explains what it is, what it was used for, how it worked. Most visitors read the placard, glance at the dummy, and move on. It's not dramatic. It's not heroic. It's just a bag of sand. But on the night of June 5, 1944, 200 of these bags fell through the darkness over Normandy, accompanied by 6 men who knew they were probably going to die. And for 6 hours, while the greatest invasion in history fought for its survival on the beaches, thousands of German soldiers hunted shadows in the bocage. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Just burlap and sand and the ghosts of men who'd already moved on. In the archives of the 352nd Infantry Division, there's a report dated June 6, 1944, 0430 hours. It describes a large-scale airborne landing northeast of Saint-Mir-Église, estimated at battalion strength or larger. It recommends immediate deployment of reserves to contain the threat. The report is marked with a red stamp, priority. By the time the reserves arrived, the sun was coming up, and on the beaches to the west, 150,000 men were ashore. The reserves that had been held back to deal with the phantom paratroopers were too late. The beachheads held. The invasion succeeded, and 6 men and 200 burlap dummies had bought the hours that made it possible. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are more untold histories waiting to be shared. Hit the like button if you think Operation Titanic deserves to be remembered alongside the great deceptions of the war. And here's a question for the comments. Do you think the sacrifice of Fowles and his team was a brilliant strategic masterstroke, or a tragic waste of extraordinary men on a gamble that could have failed? Let me know what you think.